Good morning or good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this webinar, Introduction to LeanNow, webinar with Randall Benson, brought to you by Swift Kanban from Digitech. A very warm welcome to those of you who will be joined, and as I speak I am seeing that the attendee count is going up and additional people are joining us. In the meantime, I will start off with just the agenda and some introductions, and we'll get going. We will start off with introductions as I just said, and after that I will provide a quick introduction to Swift Kanban and Digitech, and then hand over the webinar to Randall Benson, who will take us through the main part of the presentation, introduction to LeanNow, and finally we'll open it up to a Q&A session and hopefully have a good discussion on some of the concepts that Randall will be presenting to us. Just some housekeeping items. We will take questions via the Q&A box that you should be seeing to the bottom right of your screen. You can enter your questions anytime during the presentation. We will take them up at the end of the talk by Randall. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and slides and a copy of the recording will be made available in a follow-up email that we will send to you after the webinar. So with that, let me get started. Today's main speaker is Randall Benson. He's the CEO of Benson Consulting, and my name is Mahesh Singh. I'm a co-founder and senior vice president of product at Digitech. Randall is a self-confessed lean heretic, and you will see why as he starts to discuss LeanNow with you. He's a lean consultant, coach, and trainer, and does a lot of consulting and training and working with a variety of industries from manufacturing to distribution, healthcare, government, insurance, and high tech, and a variety of others. Randall is based out of the Seattle area. He's also the author of a book called The Quest Effect, which is a significant book in terms of organizational transformation, and a very interesting read if you happen to come by it. Before I turn the presentation to Randall, just a very short introduction to Digitech and Swift Kanban. Digitech is a pioneer in collaborative products and solutions for helping geographically distributed teams to manage their work and their projects more effectively. We are headquartered in Cupertino, California, and we have offices around the world. We have over 300,000 users in the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific, and our products are primarily in the area of Lean Kanban, Agile Application Lifecycle Management, and Project and Portfolio Management. Swift Kanban, of course, is our flagship Lean Kanban product, and is being used by customers worldwide for a variety of implementations of Kanban and Lean-based software development and a number of other business functions management. Just a quick introduction to the products. Swift Kanban, as I just mentioned, is a visual management tool for software development, project management, and a variety of other functions. Here you see a snapshot of a Kanban board and a very simple workflow that's been modeled on this, which shows a typical software development workflow. And Kanban, of course, is a very generic method for improving your processes and visualizing your processes, and can be used for a variety of different processes, whether software or non-software. Here is another example where Kanban can be used for marketing, and we have customers who use it for marketing and HR and sales and a variety of other functions. And it could be used as a personal Kanban tool for personal effectiveness, personal efficiency, and personal sort of organization, and can be used for managing the daily chores, for managing your work, or even for planning an office party, as you see an example here. In general, we have a pretty extensive technology and product stack, and we can answer any questions that you might have on this offline out of this webinar, and we'll provide you contact information for that. And just a quick last slide on the type of customers that we have, and as you'll see from here, we have some very well-known and respectable brands around the world who are our customers. that use our products for managing both software and IT as well as non-IT projects. So with that, I'm going to hand over control to Randall, and as I said earlier, we will take questions throughout the presentation, and we will answer those questions once Randall has been through his presentation. So Randall, over to you.
Thank you, Mahesh. Can you hear me yet?
Yes, perfect.
You can hear me okay? Thank you. I lost my button that turned off my mute, so thank you for turning me on. I'd like to welcome you today. I'm going to start my slide presentation up here, so it'll be full screen. This webinar is on LeanNow, as Mahesh mentioned. It's an accelerated approach to Lean implementation, and I'm coming to you from the Seattle area, as Mahesh mentioned. I actually live on a little tiny island way up in the most farthest northwest corner of the United States. I'm the last inhabited U.S. island before the Canadian border, so I'm kind of out here in the outback, which is might say. I think it's interesting that Mahesh mentioned that I'm sometimes called a lean heretic. I've done a lot of traditional lean with organizations over the decades. And as I have, my view on non-manufacturing applications of lean has changed over time to the point where today I'm going to depart from traditional lean orthodoxy in several ways. I'll kind of try to listen out here on the slide, but in my opinion, there's been very little change in traditional lean over the last 30 years since it came from the factory, maybe even the last 40 or 50 years. It's basically a manufacturing model based on the Toyota production system, and we still treat it like that in industries where I believe we should be using a different approach. Most of us are actually work in non-manufacturing organizations, and if we do, there's a good chance that we're doing lean backwards, that we're actually starting at the wrong place and therefore taking a lot of extra time and spending a lot of extra money. So the cost of doing lean the way using the manufacturing model, if we're not in the manufacturing world, is really staggering, causing organizations to spend, at least in U.S. dollars, spending millions of dollars they didn't have to spend and taking months and sometimes even years of extra effort in order to get to a point which they could have got to very quickly if they'd taken a different approach. To take a different approach requires new technologies that we didn't have 30 or 40 years ago, and one of the key ones being the virtual kanban board. And by using those two new technologies, we're able to really change the game for service organizations. And that allows us to rethink many of the lean precepts that we've held dear over the years if we've come from the manufacturing world. So instead of taking months and years to get to the point where we can manage with lean principles, it's now possible to really go from zero to managing with lean principles in 30 days or less, and be looking at significant bottom line results within the next 30 days after that. So in 60 days, a lot of organizations that are taking this different approach are getting very significant bottom line results for their organization. One of the real beauties of this is that it's incredibly simple compared to the traditional way of implementing lean. So there's really only 5 very straightforward steps that are required to get to the point where you're managing with lean principles. By the way, if you're an IT person and you're doing Agile, you're probably already a lean heretic. IT software development has gotten out ahead of the rest of the world in the way it applies lean principles to its business. And you'll also see some parallels between what I'm talking about here and Agile software development type issues. Obviously, Agile has adopted lean principles, and so what I've done is tried to borrow some of that technology back from Agile to reapply it to lean practices when those practices are used in non-manufacturing environments. So I'll just proceed ahead here. So it's really about a new group of leaders who are interested in becoming lean. 30 or 40 years ago, everybody who wanted to be lean seemed to work for a manufacturing organization. And in the late 80s and 90s, and certainly today, lean has spread far beyond the shop floor. Most organizations that are looking at lean implementations now are actually in non-manufacturing environments. I think that about 2.5 to 3 times more employees work in service and non-manufacturing areas than they do in manufacturing jobs in India. And the percentages are even higher in the United States in terms of how many people work in service and non-manufacturing related jobs. So the vast majority of organizations can become lean, and they can become lean much faster if they apply practices that are more tailored to their industry than if they apply the traditional manufacturing approach. So I'm thinking that if you're with me today, you're probably from one of these types of organizations. So the LeanNow approach is really designed for any non-manufacturing environment, in particular services, high-tech, including software development, healthcare, government, schools, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, those kinds of organizations where the process is their product rather than having a physical product. Those are the kinds of organizations that this is really designed for. And I hope you'll be thinking in those terms as we go through this. So I want to take just a minute and talk about a definition of lean that I'll be using throughout the workshop here. Basically, I'm thinking of lean as creating and sustaining an uninterrupted flow of customer value by involving everybody in the elimination of waste that impedes flow, and ultimately all waste in every form in the organization. I wanted to bring this out because if you've been brought up in traditional lean principles and lean thinking, you probably recall a definition that goes something like involving everybody in the organization in the elimination of waste in every form. And while that's a useful definition, it actually will cause a misdirection if we don't work in factories, which I'm going to address a little bit later. So I'm going to use this today as a working definition where I'm emphasizing flow first, and then indicating that waste is really in service to flow. So the reason we want to reduce waste is to improve the flow of value to the end user or the external customer. So given that definition, I believe that you're lean, and you can call yourself lean when you're managing your daily operations with lean principles and you're improving your flow of value continuously from that point forward. So that's the definition I'm going to use today. So that when you can get to the point where you're managing daily operations and improving it, then I think it's safe to call yourself a lean organization. A lot of organizations believe they're lean, but actually can't do these two steps on an ongoing basis. I rather like this picture here. I think it kind of sums up perfectly the problem that non-manufacturing organizations are facing. This is kind of a great steampunk fantasy. But some of us actually are trying to basically apply the equivalent of this to our actual organizations. So again, trying to apply the factory approach to non-manufacturing organizations. And like many organizations, you may eventually get it to work, but the question is, at what cost have you incurred by the time you get this working? You know, how many years, how many extra, how many resources, how much money have you spent in order to get this airplane to fly? The reason for that, primarily, as I mentioned earlier, is that there's an imbalance because we've been saddled with an implementation approach that stems from a factory floor going back over 50 years. And those approaches have really lost their relevancy in today's non-manufacturing organizations. And as a result, the lean implementations are lengthy affairs with high costs and disruptions and lots of roadblocks and lots of extra time and lack of support. As a result of applying this approach. So what I was told by leaders is they didn't want to take this approach. They wanted something that let them implement lean rapidly without these excessive costs and disruptions and hassles and roadblocks so that they could get bottom line results fairly quickly. When I worked primarily in manufacturing many years ago, we were always told, well, there's no problem with applying manufacturing principles to service organizations. After all, they have processes too. They just have to think metaphorically instead of literally about what we're doing. But I've come to believe that isn't actually true, that there's many differences between service, non-manufacturing, and manufacturing organizations that go far beyond metaphorical thinking. And we really have to account for those differences in order to do appropriate lean when we're not working in the factory world. I mentioned the traditional definition of lean involving everybody in the organization and the elimination of waste in every form. And I think that definition alone would lead us to believe that if we're eliminating waste, we're doing lean. So I work with a lot of organizations who are on this endless loop of waste reduction. After all, there's waste all over every organization. So once you start identifying waste using your list of your 7 or 8 wastes and doing continuous improvement to get rid of that waste, that process can go on year after year. You can always do more of it. You can always get better at it. So a lot of organizations think, because they've read the definition of lean as being about waste reduction, that if they're doing these Kaizen events and other waste reduction efforts, that they're actually doing lean. The fact is, you could do waste reduction forever, and while it's beneficial, it will never get you to actually being able to manage daily operations with lean principles. That's a different problem that needs to be attacked with different tools. So right away, we recognize that we don't want to start people down the endless waste reduction loop model if we're going to actually be able to manage with lean principles. Here's an example of lean principles, or an approach to lean, I should say. This one's borrowed from a very well-known hospital corporation that's world famous for their approach to lean and their application of factory principles to their hospital. They actually call they call it the, I won't name the hospital, but the hospital name operating system, as if it was a factory model. In fact, I heard one of the leaders of the organization speak at a conference recently, and she basically said that our approach is a manufacturing model applied to delivering healthcare. And this is the result that their organization and many other organizations applying the factory model are getting. So first, there's this background of infrastructure on the gray triangle of business and goals and training and change management and preparing people and taking trips to Japan and visiting factories and going away for weeks of training at a time, all that kind of project stuff in the background. And then there's the steps of lean, like starting out with a level of waste removal, workplace reorganization, reducing setups, creating standard work, mistake-proofing their processes, and then finally, after all of that, at the tip of this iceberg, or the tip of this pyramid, they finally get to doing flow. And I think this basically underscores the problem is that given this model, there's so much work to do before you finally get to the point when you get the flow where you can manage daily operations. So that could be months or years down the road before you actually get to that point. In fact, here's a story that I encountered. He's not really named Ted, but I'll call him Ted here. When I met Ted, he worked for a hospital corporation. They had 5 large hospitals they were managing, and they were doing lean across all their hospitals, a traditional wall-to-wall implementation. He, at that point, has spent over 18 months and $1.5 million US in consulting fees in this endless list of activities. They're listed here on the slide, and these are just a few of the activities that they were actually doing during this implementation process. And he told me that he had at least another year to go and at least another $1 million US for consulting fees before he was actually going to be able to run his daily operations with lean principles. And so during this whole period, he was only getting the small bottom line results that came from the actual waste reduction efforts, but getting no benefits at all from actually managing with lean. So he's talking about 2.5 years and several $1 million. The person from the hospital corporation that created that pyramid, in her presentation at the conference, she said that they've been into lean so far for 15 years, and they were still spending money and still doing work. Of course, lean is a journey, and I understand that, but they probably went for over 5 years in that journey before they saw any bottom line results or were able to manage their operations on a daily basis with lean principles. So that's what we're trying to avoid with LeanNow, excuse me, is to come up with a way to do this quickly instead of using the manufacturing model and spending years of work to try to get to that point. So what happens to these organizations that use the manufacturing model and do all this front-loaded work before they ever get to the point where they can manage with lean principles is they're taking months to do this. They're spending millions in fees, endless waste removal loops, this draining the resources of the organization. In Ted's case, he had 20 people in his project office and over 200 people in the organization were actually assigned to be on different lean teams around the organization. So a huge resource drain for the organization. Disruption and fatigue for the organization. It's difficult to do their regular work when they're spending so much of their resources doing lean. Really disappointing results because they had to wait for so long before they were able to manage on a lean basis where they would really get the benefits. So doing the waste reduction gets spot benefits, but the big dramatic changes that you hear so much about with lean implementations, that really comes from when you're actually managing the flow on a daily basis. And of course, all this results in sagging support, so there's this huge risk for the project that the support is going to run out before the results actually start to come in. So it's very stressful for the leaders and stressful for the organization as they wonder if they have enough staying power to stay with the lean project until it's getting the results they were hoping for. And I think one of the real sad parts about our approach to lean in non-manufacturing organizations is that so many non-manufacturing organizations are relatively small and they just believe they can't afford to go through this kind of process in order to implement lean. So they don't even consider lean as an option, when in fact, if they would take a different approach, they would be able to easily do lean and easily benefit from the kind of results that the larger organizations are getting when they do lean. I think a state that would be better would be if we could do implementation very rapidly at a very low cost and get results immediately instead of waiting for years. Be able to do this smoothly and easily because it's a simplified process. Sustain support because we'll be getting results quickly and this won't be stretched out for years. We have a tool that we could target waste removal rather than doing broad brush wall-to-wall waste removal. We have a way to find the high leverage waste and remove it first and get the most benefit we possibly could, and something that would work as well for smaller organizations as it would for large organizations. So that's kind of the design goals for LeanNow that we started with. And the question we asked is, can we go from zero, not doing lean at all, to being able to manage with lean principles on a daily basis within 30 days or less? So that was our design goal when we started working on this development. That would require a different approach than we used in the factory days. We simply knew that we couldn't reapply the factory model under those conditions. We have to have something that was purpose-built for non-manufacturing organizations. And we have to use advanced technologies that weren't available in the lean world 30 or more years ago. Those of you who have worked in lean factory settings know that there's a real preference in those organizations for using physical and mechanical approaches to creating lean flow as opposed to high technology approaches. So it really wasn't until the Agile folks started making electronic versions of the traditional lean kanban boards that we started to see technology applied to lean, and that technology turned out to be incredibly useful for non-manufacturing organizations. So non-manufacturing organizations, look tremendously different than manufacturing organizations. And they don't have the same kind of waste that causes us to have to work on those wastes before we can create flow. If you look at a factory environment, lots of times there's mountains of actual physical work in process, physical waste. There's machines, large machines that have to be moved into new areas to create the manufacturing cells. There's material transport systems that have to be torn out and replaced. So the actual waste reduction efforts in a factory are usually required to handle the physical encumbrances to flow. But in non-manufacturing organizations, usually we're working with an intangible product with personalized work areas instead of manufacturing cells, high variations in demand, geographically dispersed work groups as opposed to co-located employees. People are working not in one value stream at a time like in a factory, but lots of times non-manufacturing people will have their hands in 3 or 4 or 5 value streams that they have responsibilities for at the same time. And lots of times we see many concurrent flows in the organization that the employees have to be aware of simultaneously. So it's a much different environment than manufacturing. And what we needed to do was really, change our approach to accommodate those realities. So I think a solution was to try to start with flow. So because we didn't have physical encumbrances that were keeping us from getting right to flow, we could do flow right away as opposed to doing flow someday after we got rid of all that waste. And then use flow with lean tools in order to be able to manage on a daily basis using lean principles, and then use that flow itself to target waste. So traditionally in non-manufacturing companies, we built value stream maps and then looked at the value stream map and tried to figure out what kind of waste we wanted to reduce, and then we would create these waste reduction events that lasted a week or more in order to get rid of targeted waste. But now we have a very precise tool that can target specifically the waste that that's holding up the flow, and by targeting that waste, we get a lot of leverage by in terms of our continuous improvement efforts that we make. And we can use that waste reduction to further streamline the flow and improve the flow, create more value, have less costs, more responsiveness, and also make it even a better tool to target the next round of waste. And that results in our ability to quickly create end-user benefits instead of having to wait for years to do it. And all of that is enabled by virtual kanban board technology, like the systems that are provided by Digite with Swift Kanban. So there's lots of kanban board technologies. Those of you that work in IT know that. But most of them can't be adapted to lean situations because they're too hardwired for the software development world. So there's just a few, and I consider Digite to be the best, that have the flexibility to be repurposed for lean environments as opposed to software development environments only. So going back to our pyramid here of the traditional model for implementing lean that so many non-manufacturing companies have decided to use. What we want to do at this point with LeanNow is to basically flip that pyramid over, where flow is the first thing we do rather than the last thing we do. So now we have an approach that looks like this, where flow is where we start, and then instead of having all those layers, one for waste reduction and one for workplace organization, etc., we basically ask, what's the rate limiting factor? What's the impediment to flow that if we cleared it, we would be able to deliver more value faster to our end user, and then use the appropriate tool regardless of what that impediment is to eliminate it. So sometimes it'll be a workplace reorganization problem. Sometimes it'll be one of the 8 wastes that has to be removed. Sometimes it'll be eliminating a setup somewhere. So, like for example, turnovers on operating rooms in hospitals is the kind of project that would be setup related. So whatever it is, we would then use the specific tool that worked for the thing that was holding up the flow, always going back and asking, what's the rate limiting factor? What is the thing that's keeping us from improving the flow of value? So it's very similar in that sense to Goldrate's idea of the theory of constraints and asking what's the constraint, what's holding up the flow. I mentioned a moment ago that the virtual Kanban board was the technical breakthrough that we needed to enable the LeanNow idea to work quickly in organizations. And the reason for that is because if we had to actually go in and clean up the workplace and do rounds of waste reduction, etc., it would take a long time to do, and we'd be in the same situation we are in manufacturing. But if we're able to go right to the Kanban board and take the flow that already exists, that we can ferret out from the organization as it is, and put that on the Kanban board where it's highly visible and can be managed with lean principles like Kanbans and pull systems and limiting the amount of work in process and holding the work at the beginning of the process in a backlog, etc. Then we're able to actually, without changing the workplace dramatically, move right to the ability to manage with lean principles. So that's kind of what we've tried to achieve. So organizations can master these lean principles, very quickly using the LeanNow approach. And so these are basically core lean principles that are universal: identify value, map the value stream, create flow, establish pull, seek perfection. A very simple model. The problem is that there's all these branches that come off of this model that manufacturing people get into. Mapping the value stream can take weeks. Doing today's state and a future state and intermediate states, and identifying kanban events not kanban, but Kaizen events, etc., and using that value stream to drive process improvement. And so there's all the pyramid work that we saw a moment ago actually exists in between map the value stream and create flow. So that line is months and years long instead of the straight line that you see here. So it takes forever to get to the point where you establish pull. And the seek perfection part, as you see here, is actually moved over to right after mapping the value stream as opposed to downstream where lean principles would say it should be. So our approach isn't that radical. We've basically tried to take what you see here as good lean principle and work exactly around that circle. So instead of getting off on the side tracks that take us so much upfront time to implement. So it's not radical. Basically what we're doing is following the model that already is best practice. And we've done this by using a series of 5 simple steps. Understand the lean principles, pick a value stream and map it, build a virtual flow and set queue limits, implement pull and manage the flow, and then eliminate the waste and streamline the flow and start the process over again. So if you think of that list of activities that Ted had when he was at the hospital, or think of the steps in the lean pyramid, you can see that there's a lot of work that we don't have to do up front. We can start right in with going from the value stream to the virtual flow using kanban technology to do that, and then wait to use the flow as our tool to eliminate waste down the road. First step is to understand lean principles, and again, this is a step that in traditional models, there's a lot of waste here for service organizations because if we start sending people overseas to tour factories into 2- and 3-week training sessions and do this for every employee in production, we've created a barrier already to getting to the point where we can manage with lean. So what we've done is try to use simulations instead of using classroom type training, where we can get people involved in a conferencing type simulation and have them have this aha effect, that's the light bulb there, quickly within half a day, as opposed to taking weeks to get to the same point. So we basically try to get through all the principles that you would need to manage on a daily basis with lean principles in the half-day simulation. Here's an example of a group going through this simulation. And they'll spend about a half a day. They're collecting their measurements on that board that you see on the inset there. Once the people realize what's possible as they go through the different phases of the game, then they'll be able to refer to this game throughout their own lean implementation and use it kind of as a touchstone to understand what they want to be doing in their own processes. So just looking at phase 1 and phase 4 of this scorecard, which I put up on a cleaner chart here, you can see that they've reduced throughput time by over 7-fold, cut rush time in half, work in processes down by 9-fold, productivity has skyrocketed, customer backlog's been reduced by 75%, and so on. I love the last one, the effort has gone from high in the first phase of the game, which most closely mimics the actual work that they've been doing, to phase 4, which is very low. So even though they're getting much better performance from the process, they're also saying that it's much easier to work in this process than it was to work in the traditional approach that they'd used before. Sometimes the results can be mapped right into their own business processes. I recall one bank president that stood up at the end of the game and said, "I want this now." And he said, "We can apply this tomorrow to loan processing for our bank." And so we got started with applying this to processing mortgage loans. Other organizations need more time to explore how it would fit into their organization and how it might work for them. And it works for all kinds of different processes, so you just never know. For example, an organization might look at it for onboarding new employees, or another organization might look at it for delivering healthcare services. So every organization is different and needs to think a little differently about how they would map the principles. But the point is that they've seen all the principles in play. They've actually walked been involved in a process that applies these principles and generally have been able to see the grand scheme at one time and experience that kind of aha effect that allows them to now turn around and apply it to their own organization. The next step is pick a value stream and map it. So organizations generally have many value streams that they could map. As well as that, there's also core processes, these internal processes like running payroll, for example, that this could be applied to. We try to get people we encourage people to look at value streams and not their other core processes. But either way, they have to pick one and start there. And so the first thing they want to do is make a map of the process so they can stand back and look at it. So they usually use a version of value stream mapping to do that. And again, they could be looking at customer onboarding, outpatient services for healthcare, approving business plans, handling complaints, selling long-term care insurance online. I mean, there's just no end to the kinds of things that people might be working on as they get involved. And thinking about which value stream to use. So here's a traditional value stream map that shows the end-to-end creation of some useful outcome for an end user or hopefully a customer. And it's a typical process flow that goes from left to right. I think some of the unique things about this are there's a timeline, that kind of jagged sawtooth line across the bottom. Is keeping track of both the process time and also the time that the work sits in queue before the process. So services generally don't have a lot of inventory, but they do have a lot of queues, a lot of in baskets where work can sit. So those are the kinds of things we'd be looking at here. This is a traditional model. This model has some deficiencies for service organizations because usually in services the customer can see into our production process. So we usually put in a second line in here and separate what we call the processes that are above the line of visibility, the ones the customer can see. We separate those from the ones that the customer can't see because everything above the line of visibility affects customer perceptions and therefore has a marketing dimension to it that has to be considered as well. So another example of how services are different than manufacturing organizations. Here's a typical, I don't know if it's typical, but this is actually a government agency in the United States. And you can see that the workplace just looks terrible. And the thought of starting a workplace organization and cleaning that up would be quite an impediment to getting to the time when we could actually manage with lean principles. So instead of tackling this really messy and disorganized area, we decided to find the work and then get the work up onto the kanban board. So there may be a file on one of these desks that actually is that piece of work, but that work will also be represented on the kanban board. So we know where the work piece is, we know how much is in work in process, we know what's in the backlog, we know which work is blocked and which work isn't blocked, and we know what's waiting for a response from a customer or another party. So those are the kinds of things that the kanban board can tell us that we would never be able to ferret out of an organization that looked like this. That doesn't mean that this organization doesn't need to be cleaned up. They desperately need to be cleaned up. But we'll do that after we're managing with lean principles, not before. We won't let that become an impediment to getting to the point where we're actually doing lean. The third step is to build a virtual flow and set the key limits for that flow. It doesn't have to be a virtual flow. We do some if in physical methods if the employees are already co-located and they're all in the same, and they can all see the physical flow board. We might do that. But there's a lot of reasons, even when employees are co-located, to use a virtual kanban board because there's so much other information that's kept with that board that's useful to us. So the way we build it is we start out with the actual flow from the value stream map, and then we just basically create columns on the kanban board that represent the work on the value stream map. And this is where, for those of you who work in Agile, you'll see quite a difference between an Agile Kanban board and a Lean Kanban board because we won't have just a ready, working, done kind of model. This actually displays, these kinds of Kanban boards actually show the processes from the value stream map. And an example I use here for some of this map is actually 18 steps that are shown in the entire map. So we try to map all the critical processes. There's many other differences too between Lean for non-manufacturing and Agile software development, but there's also quite a few similarities. So we've used the map to make the board, and then we've used the processes on the map to make the columns on the board. Here's an example of a Kanban board. This is a little different graphic style than the Swift board that Mahesh showed earlier, but it's still the same Swift Kanban part, just a little different graphic look to it. And you can see that there's one board per value stream. That each process on the value stream probably created a process on the Kanban board. Each card on the Kanban board is a work piece or possibly end user deliverable that we're processing. In this case, these are complaints for rodents and illegal dumping of garbage that a government agency is handling. So that's the kind of work that we're handling here. There's a left to right flow to the board. There's a working area across the top of the board, and then below that working area is an area called ready to pull, so that we know what can be pulled into the next area. So when work is complete, it's dropped down into the ready to pull area. There's other ways to do that on Kanban boards, but that's how this example works. Here's an example in the middle of the board here of a block card. It's circled in red. That card is stuck, and that's an example of what in Toyota language they would call an andon, or a warning signal that says we've got to do something about that. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Here's another example of a warning signal. This one says we've exceeded the work in process limit for this column, and so that's going to make the board stop working in a while. It'll start backing up from that point. So somebody needs to pay attention to that and help break that problem, break that limit, so we can get work flowing. So that's the idea of a virtual Kanban board. That's an actual board that we're looking at here. I'm sorry, I have to go through these disclosures again. Very simple to use and very simple to set up. But we can usually set up a board like that if it's the first time in a couple of days, maybe 3 days at the most. A team that's already set up a board like that and needs to do a second one can usually do it in a few hours. So it's very fast to establish flow that can be managed with Lean principles if you don't try to dig into those offices where all that messy working process actually exists. When you do flow first, of course, you're not starting with a polished flow. You're starting with a minimum viable flow, the flow that you already had when you began. Sometimes we have to do a little bit of work even to create a minimum viable flow. But as soon as we have that minimum viable flow, we're able to start using pull and other flow principles to manage that flow with Lean principles. So if we spend months and years, of course, we're going to be doing a lot of waste reduction before we get to flow, and the flow will look pretty good right away. It'll be a desirable flow. We may not be at the desirable flow level when we start with this model, but we're going to use the flow itself to identify the kinds of waste that we can remove to get to that desirable flow. So actually, the time it takes to get to desirable flow is much shorter if we use this approach than if we start removing waste in every form throughout the organization. The next step is to implement, pull, and manage the flow. So this is really bringing the system live at this point. And here's a piece of a Kanban board, and you'll notice at the top there's a limit. The limit's 15. This is that complaint system again, and they have to write a letter to the violator at this point, and so that's what this step is. They can have 15 letters in process. In the working area there, they can have 6 letters, and down below in the ready to pull, they can have 6 more. That's a nice feature of the Swift Kanban practice. We can have sub-column limits, but the key right now is to look at that 15 at the top there. So that tells us we can still bring some more work into the next column. So whoever needs work in the letter close column can go over to the evaluate column and pull a card, probably first in, first out, pull the card at the top, bring it over to the next column, and now start working on that. So there doesn't get any supervisor direction or anything. If they have the capacity, they can go ahead and reach over and pull a card into the next area. When they complete one of their cards, they'll drop that card down to the ready to pull area, and then the people in the next column over in the process, the letter column, are now able to come over and get one of those cards and bring it into their area. And in that manner, the cards walk all the way down the board from the left to the right with self-directed work. The employees are running themselves without basically any intervention to deliver value in this way to the end user. We also need to hold some work if there's more work than we can do right away in a backlog situation at the beginning of the process. So here's an example of some work that hasn't been started yet, and this is held here until there's room on the board to put it on. So this came from probably a customer or upstream user. It's moved from the backlog onto the ready column, first column on the Kanban board, and that's a push to push it from the backlog onto the board. Once it gets to the board, then we pull the work across the board using the pull system from that point, and depending on those Kanban limits to tell us how much we can pull at what time. When we're done with that flow and the work's worked its way all the way across the board, then we are ready to deliver value to the downstream customer or external customer to the organization. So at this point, a lot of people are wondering, so what do managers do if they don't have to actually be part of deciding what work's done when and dispatching that work every day? Or what are their key jobs? Well, what's happened here is this manager person has moved from being a firefighter to more of a supporter in their role. So they will triage and release the backlog to the board, establish work and process limits and queue limits for the different columns on the board, assist when one of those signals like a column limits exceeded or a card stuck. They'll assist when those signals sound and help get the system flowing again. They have a tremendous role in supporting the improvement projects for continuous improvement, helping the team get what it needs. If the flow gets out of balance, either short term or because improvements have changed how much work is done where, then they help rebalance the flow, track the metrics, which are a lot of those metrics are generated automatically by the Kanban system. So they'll track those to make sure that the performance is there. Reinforce standard work, so when improvements made, this is the supervisor or manager's job to make sure that those new standards are held and that the improvements are maintained. And of course, honor self-directed work, not meddle in the work of individual employees on an hour-to-hour basis, which can be a real struggle for managers who are used to doing firefighting and controlling the work in detail. The next step is, and final step, is to eliminate the waste and streamline the flow. So it's not enough just to set up a really great system, and I've noticed that a lot of organizations I worked with are tempted to stop there because usually when they get the flow working and they're managing the principles, they're already getting huge benefits in terms of operational benefits. And it's tempting just to say, well, that's terrific. We've got so much benefit. We're done, and not want to move on to the waste reduction. But of course, we're not really lean if we're not doing continuous improvement. So the next step is to eliminate that waste in the flow, because the flow started out with a lot of waste in it. We didn't try to improve it ahead of time, so we know that there's huge opportunity by doing this. I recommend a traditional plan, do, check, act, or plan, do, study, act if you prefer. Improvement cycle, this is basically the scientific method, doing experiments to test the ideas before you actually recommend them for improvement. And it works beautifully, and the real difference between this approach and what traditional lean would do is that instead of using wall-to-wall identification of the 8 wastes all over the organization, we're trying to identify the wastes that are limiting the flow, and we're using the flow itself to identify those rate limiting factors, and then using those for the most part as the things we want to attack. I don't know how culturally specific this is, but I know in the United States, recent studies showed that 70% of the employees in American companies are disengaged or actively disengaged from their work. Otherwise, they're bored and sick of what they do, and they're not really turned on to their work. And one of the really exciting things about Lean is that the ability to control your own work and redesign your own work and be part of these kind of fun experiments to make improvements has the effect of really bringing people back with some interest to their work. And so combating this disengagement is one of the real significant parts of doing the process improvement. So we don't want to skip it, even if we didn't need it for to make the process work better, which we do. It still has real benefits for just engaging employees back in their work. One of the cool things is that we use the Kanban board for flow, but we can also use the same kind of Kanban board to do kind of agile project management. So we can use the the Kanban board to actually do the plan, do, check, act tracking of our improvements as we work on them until we get to the point where they are improved. And then once they're approved, we can go back and streamline the flow. So the improvement off of the continuous improvement Kanban board influences the flow board, because those improvements allow us to reduce the limits on the columns. When we reduce the limits, that more tightly couples the processes and decreases the amount of time it takes work to flow across the board. So the performance of our flow improves as those continuous improvements come back around to influence the limits on the board. And so it's a virtuous cycle, but we can use the Kanban board in two different contexts, and it's really handy to do that. Since we're using it anyway, we might as well also use it for that second process. So here we reduce the time, or reduce the limits from 15 to 10, which will mean that there's five less pieces that we have to wait for before we get to the next step in the process. So everything will flow faster as we do that. So recall the two tests at the beginning that I mentioned to see if you're lean or not, at least by my definition. First one was, are you currently managing your daily operations with lean principles? And if you are using the Kanban board for flow, then that's how you get to that. And the second one was, are you improving continuously? So that's the idea of the improvement Kanban board, is another way to apply that technology to help in another dimension of lean, which is doing the improvements. So these are the basic 5 steps we've used to get an organization up and running with lean principles rapidly. We've done this in as little as 6 days. We can consistently do it within 30 days, and this is for one value stream. And also, when we're done, not only is the organization ready for more rounds of continuous improvement, but also ready to replicate this model in other value streams as well. So the idea of LeanNow, just to summarize, is to start with flow first, build the virtual Kanban boards to track the flow, even though the physical flow may still be messed up, using that flow that we're tracking to target the most high leverage waste and reduce that waste first. That will improve the flow and improve our ability to identify the next piece of waste that has to be removed. Remove the waste to tighten the flow and reduce the time and cost it takes to deliver value to the customer, and basically tighten that flow so that we can get awesome outcomes both for customers and also produce rapid bottom line results for the organization. So that's the idea basically of something that was easy to implement, gets amazing results, and allows you to go from 0 to lean in 30 days or less. This would probably be a good time to stop talking and start kind of checking in with you folks and seeing what questions and comments you have.
So we have a couple of questions here, and we understand everyone as in how different is this from pure agile, and how virtual Kanban boards can actually help people with lean now.
Right. I think people from IT, when they see that virtual Kanban board, kind of see a huge similarity between this and Agile. And in fact, I've borrowed the board back from the Agile world. The real differences there's several. One is we're looking at a recurring multi-step process when we're looking at lean. So we usually have a lot more columns on the board as we track work through those columns. Also, the continuous improvement part tends to be a lot more well-defined and significant in the lean world. And also the handling of the backlog is considerably different because we're not doing sprints. It's a continuous release of work from the backlog to the board if we're doing lean. And but the boards have a lot of similarity. I think that's really the part that's quite similar between that and Agile. So Agile is actually a special case of applying lean to non-manufacturing operations, and so what we've developed is a more generalized version for other areas. It also works for IT, particularly if you're doing continuous release instead of a batch release kind of model, as a sprint would be.
Okay. We have another question from Ashish here. Question basically, has anything like this been tried in an organization where there are multiple flows and non-repetitive work?
All right. Well, multiple flows, and what was the second part?
and non-repetitive work?
Repetitive is a requirement to do lean. I work with lots of organizations that have non-repetitive work or work that doesn't repeat very often, like preparing the strategic plan for the organization. And so in those cases, we use Agile project management for that. And so we still use the kanban board, but we treat it like a project as opposed to a process flow. So organizations that can do lean don't have much problem making the switch from that to Agile project management. So that's how we handle that.
Okay. This will probably be a last question for the day because we're running out of time. But there's a couple of questions mostly based on, for example, you talked about a flow first lean model, right? And
right.
What happens when there are a lot of processes that are interdependent on each other? Could an attempt to streamline a single process backfire? Isn't this unhealthy as such? So, would you, in this particular case, go for an overhaul of, the entire system?
Well, yes. Sometimes you do need to do an overhaul, but the entire system is really what we're trying to think about. So if we're looking at an end-to-end process, that would be how we define a value stream from the time we get input until we deliver value. That's more than a single process. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't parallel flows and there isn't work that splits and has to be recombined later. Those are all special challenges to doing lean kanban boards, and we have ways to handle that, but they're kind of user specific. The other thing is that if we have multiple value streams that we're using with this process, we may need to do coordination at the next level up, as the output of one value stream could interact with the output of another, and that may be what the question was about. And so that happens as well, that the value streams interact with each other. And yes, that's a coordination issue that has to be handled as a kind of a more special case than the generic doing one value stream is clean and not interacting with other value streams. We do that, but it's you have to know the details and specifics to know how to approach it.
Okay. Looks like we're running out of time, Randall. So, any quick last words for today?
Well, I'd like to thank everybody who was able to join us today. I had a great time going through this, and I hope it was of some value to you. And maybe we'll have a chance to talk again when it's time for the Getting Started with LeanNow workshop. So, thank you.